Let me start with a little test today. Knock, knock. How did you know that? How did you know how to respond? Well, you've learned a form. And one of the things that I've been spending some time with you the last several weeks, we've been looking again at the form of the resurrection stories, trying to hear what the gospel storytellers had to say about the type of congregation that would be formed when we listen and pay close attention to these stories. You've been very kind and gracious, and today I want to read yet another one of these stories because form shapes the way we hear, see, and listen. Will you stand with me today as we honor the authority of the Lord's Word? And I want to read beginning at chapter 21 of the Gospel of John, verse 1. It's another story of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far off from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153. Though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." But now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breaking breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." Jesus said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Simon Peter said, and felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Brothers, sisters, this is the word of the Lord, the risen Lord, who comes again and again to those who bear his name in the world. And we've been taught to say, "Thanks be to God." You can be seated today. I've been thinking these last few weeks with you about how do you end the gospel. Ending a gospel is not an easy thing. You go to all the time and trouble to interview the eyewitness accounts, to share the stories that have circulated in the discipleship community. You've spent all this time writing these stories down carefully, trying to capture the meaning, the significance of the fact that the risen Jesus is alive again, which means you can run into him literally anywhere. Now, the gospel writers knew and understood from the very beginning that what they were proclaiming to the world around them was preposterous. People don't just die and then live again. And yet the gospel storytellers saw fit to tell their stories in such a way to make it sure that at the very center, the core of the Christian faith is this nominal notion that Jesus, we're not yet done with him. He's not yet done with us. He keeps coming back to us again and again and again, and you can never really expect where he's going to show up because he goes where he wants to go. That's why he was raised on Easter morning a long time before daybreak. He had a lot of people to see and a lot of places to go. Now, all the gospel writers, they go about their business trying to tell us how to end the gospel. Matthew, you remember Matthew. Matthew says that Pilate came to, the Jewish leaders came to Pilate and said to him, we remember what that impostor said when he was alive, that after 3 days he would rise again from the dead. So give us permission to put an armed guard in front of the tomb. In other words, resurrection is against the law. You knew that, didn't you? And so Pilate says, well, you have some soldiers, go make it as secure as you can. And so they went to try to do so. That has to be the most unlucky military assignment in all human history. You can no more stop risen Jesus from raising again from the dead than you can stop the wind by shooting a machine gun. It just doesn't work that way. Do you remember how Matthew ends his story? He says there was a great earthquake, and the angel from heaven descended down, rolled away the stone from the tomb, and sat on it with whatever it is that angels have in the way of haunches, as if to say, what do you think of that? In other words, God will have the last word, not Caesar, not Pilate, not the rulers and the authorities. Only God knows the story that's yet to be told. That's the way Matthew ends the story. Mark, a little different. Mark's gospel, 16th chapter, the first 8 verses, the original ending of Mark's gospel. It obviously left some unsatisfied because they went about setting to add other endings to the Gospels. Most of them are in footnotes in your Bible. But the first 8 verses, you remember the women who come there to the morning of resurrection, come to the tomb trying to decorate and do right for dead Jesus. They show up and find that somebody has already rolled away the tomb. And when they look inside, they see a young man clothed in white apparel. And he says, why are you here looking for the living among the dead? Jesus has gone ahead of you to Galilee, just as he said. Do you remember that? And the story says, Mark says in verse 8, chapter 16, that they ran away from the tomb after being given the message that the tomb is empty and told to tell Jesus' disciples that he's still on the loose. They run away for fear, and astonishment has seized them. In other words, to translate more literally what it says there in Mark chapter 16, verse 8, they didn't tell nothing to nobody, says the gospel storyteller. I want to ask you this morning, why did you show up if they didn't tell nothing to nobody? I mean, we had to have some word of the empty tomb, otherwise none of us would be here. But we come week after week after week. What's Mark done? Mark has put a little bit of reader response into the story. In other words, the real proof of the risen Jesus is what happens after we know about it. Because we're entrusted with the opportunity to share the story and to tell others and to go about our business with the new reality that Jesus is still alive and he is powerful even over the powers of hopelessness and danger and death. Do you understand? Now, last week I was with you and we read the story about Luke tells, trying to end his gospel. Because this is not exactly reader response. Luke wants to tell us a story about what the disciples do. And you remember there was Cleopas and another disciple. I said last week it was probably his wife. They were arguing on their way out of town, out of Jerusalem, on their way to Emmaus. But in that argument, they decide nonetheless to inconvenience themselves, to open their doors, and to invite this stranger who comes alongside them, wondering what it is they're arguing about. It's Jesus, but their eyes have not yet been opened to see him for who he really is. Good thing that's the last time that ever happened. Jesus, the risen Jesus, shows up and we don't really know who he is. And Jesus acts as if he's going to go on farther, go on beyond them at the end of their journey. And they invite him. Nonetheless, even though they're tired and it's the end of the day, they invite him to come in and spend time with them. In other words, they inconvenience themselves to show hospitality to a stranger, just like Jesus had told them. And there, his phone rang. No, there in that place, he starts serving them. He's the guest, but now he insists upon being the host. What does he do? He takes the bread and breaks the bread and blesses the bread and gives it away. This is the mark of his way with us all the time. He takes our lives and he blesses everything he takes, and he breaks it. It can't stay the same after he's laid his hands on it. And he does all that in order to give us away. That's the way Luke ended the story. Nobody, however, spends as much time, as much effort trying to end the gospel as this gospel storyteller named John. Already by the 30th verse of chapter 20, John was leaning out over the page and making "I'm done here" sounds as he was narrating. He said, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. That's the way that John seems to wrap up the story, but he doesn't wrap up the story. He adds another chapter, chapter 21 of the Gospel of John. Why does he do that? Everybody could tell. He's already told the story about Jesus appearing behind locked doors to his disciples. We had that a couple weeks ago on Easter Sunday. And yet John goes on to tell another story. Why does he do that? Well, this is the way it works with stories. Stories begin because something happens. That's what gives rise to the story. And then we end stories by drawing the narrative circle back to a close. We come to the end of the story and we resume normal life, and everybody goes to a position of rest again, and that's the way it is. But if we let all the stories end that way, that would really create for us as readers, as listeners, a kind of expectation that with the end of the story, we're done with reality. Jesus was raised from the dead on the day of Easter Sunday, raised from the dead on the day of resurrection. And now that that's done, we're all done. We've learned everything we can learn about Jesus. And we come week after week after week back to church. Why? Because we've already heard the basic story. No, this is one of those stories that creates an expectation in us, an expectation of newness. And frankly, that's not really what most of us want in this life. Edmund Steinley, who was a great preacher of an earlier generation, said at my age, frankly, it's not newness that I want every morning. Like Ecclesiastes says in the 5th chapter, I don't want newness. I want my slippers right underneath my bed where I left them last night when I went to sleep. And I want my Raisin Bran on the table, and I want my orange juice on the table. Frankly, at my age, he said, there's a lot of things I can do without, and especially in the morning, and newness is one of them. I don't really want anything new. You see, most of us conspire, even if we don't intend to do so, to not do much with the story of the fact that Jesus has been raised from the dead. You know, think about that. Week after week, we keep showing up here, And God has a right to ask a question from time to time. Why is it that you people know all the truth about this life, and yet you don't seem to be doing as much as I might have hoped for all this world in which you live, simply because Jesus has been raised from the dead? Why is that? Well, we don't really want that kind of newness, apparently. So every once in a while, I just shut up long enough to pay attention and start listening to a text. And that's what I've been trying to do this week, listening to this text, this story that John tells us in John chapter 21. Maybe I should just pay attention and talk with you about some of the details that popped off the page as I looked. I want to begin there by saying it's an odd story. Odd story is that the location is named. It's by the Sea of Tiberias. And John goes on to tell us that there are 7 disciples there. And Jesus, listen to this. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. The doubling of purpose. In other words, it's something that's so important, John has to tell us more than once. Jesus shows himself to his disciples, and he showed himself in this way. How does he do that? Well, we know that one of the things that happens when a narrative is stuck, when we get stuck in a story, you go back to the old routine. Anybody ever try to do that? You go back to the things that work. You go back to the things that always had been capable of carrying the weight, the freight, the weight of all of your experience in earlier times. And so there by the Sea of Tiberias, 5 of the 7 disciples named, Simon Peter says, I'm going fishing. And the others say, all in favor say aye, and the ayes have it by a landslide. Let's all go fishing. We're going to go with you. So Simon Peter is returning to their work. They're commercial fishermen after all. He's saying, in effect, it's time for us to pay the bills. Maybe we need to feed some mouths. We need to pay off the mortgage on the boat. We have to get back to work. It's nice. I like the fact that Jesus is alive. That's all well and good. But if it's all the same to you, I still need to make a living. And so I still need to figure out how to get on from here. And so they decide to go back fishing. And the only problem is it doesn't work to go back to the routine. Have you noticed this? Resurrection, I don't mean to break this to you without warning, but resurrection doesn't fit into anything else. You can't just file that away and say, well, I'll get around to dealing with that at its own time. If Jesus is raised from the dead, then that is the most important fact. Everything else has to orient itself to this new reality that nobody was expecting, nobody was anticipating, that nobody can really, frankly, explain. Sometimes we scream with delight just to hear about it. So here's resurrection. It doesn't fit into everything. What are we going to do? I know that sometimes you have to listen to the story. Here's these commercial fishermen heading back to shore, back into the marina, after being out all night long, and they haven't caught a thing. They got completely skunked. And every fisherman knows that the happiest moment of your day is coming back to the marina with nothing in your catch box. And some dip on the shore or at the pier is yelling out, children! You listen to this. Children, who's his daddy? I mean, who are we talking about? Children, you haven't caught any fish, have you? In other words, it's a question that assumes the negative response. You haven't caught any fish, have you? No, they haven't caught any fish. And then this dip on the shoreline, who's calling them children, says to them, gives them some unsolicited advice. Throw your net on the right side, you'll find some fish. Well, that's just what we need. We needed somebody like you to show up here and tell us what we need to do, as if we haven't already tried it. I mean, we do this professionally for a living. I don't know about you, but... And yet, when they throw their nets on the right side, it works. It works. Now the net is full. They say later, somebody sat around and counted them, 151, 152, 153 large fish. And the net this side of Easter is not yet breaking. What's going on here? And the disciple that Jesus loved, the beloved disciple, which I guess is all of us, says to Peter, "It is the Lord." How does he know that? Well, he's seen this sort of thing before. You remember back in Luke chapter 5, Jesus was preaching to some people, and he asked Simon Peter to take his boat off a little bit from shore, and Jesus sits down in the boat because he's been crushed and crowded with all these people. And there he teaches them, and then at the end of his teaching, he says to Simon Peter, "Go out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." And Peter says, "We've done that all night and we didn't catch anything. We were mending our nets when you showed up." And yet, nevertheless, epistates. In other words, yes, master. That's the first time Peter calls him master in the Gospel of Luke. First of 7 times. It's never used again anywhere else in the New Testament. In other words, it's a military term. It's a term that connotes respect and admiration. It's a term that suggests, I know something about Jesus, is that he's an authority, even in ways about my life. He knows things about what I do that I don't yet know. Epistates. Yes, master. Aye. And Peter throws the net back into the deep water, and this time the net is so full, it's about to tear. Do you remember the story? And Peter says, "Lord, get away from me, for I'm a sinful man. I can't even be in your presence. You're so powerful, so magnificent in your authority." In other words, if something changes, you were before having inadequate results, improper outcomes, and now everything is overflowing to abundance and everything is going with the blessing of God. And you know that you're not any smarter, you're not any better as a commercial fisherman, you're not any more well-equipped than you were before, then it must be the word of Jesus that makes the difference. It's the Lord. I was in the Netherlands a few years ago at a global theology conference for our denomination, and I met Christian Sarmiento, leader of our church in South America, at that conference. He was telling us a little story over breakfast one morning. We had time to listen to him. He said, "Well, I just got back from Ecuador. I was sent to Ecuador as a missionary to lead and to teach tribal leaders the gospel of Jesus Christ, and particularly the doctrine of holiness, how you could be set apart, sanctified, set apart for holy use and service." He said, I showed up in Ecuador to teach my first lesson, 12 tribal leaders, and when I got there, I found out none of them had any more than a first-grade education. I looked at my college textbook on the gospel of holiness, and these people had a first-grade education. He said, I was spending a lot of time in translation. I would read a paragraph or so, and then I would try to translate and interpret for them. And the lessons were going on forever and ever and ever, and I wasn't really very excited about the outcome. He said, one night I was in my hotel room trying to write out some new lesson plans to figure out what I was going to do with these students the next day. And there was a pounding on my door, and I opened the door, and 3 burly Interpol agents showed up in my hotel room. Interpol, International Police. And he said, they wanted to know, what are you, Colombian? What are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm just teaching the doctrine of holiness. Well, we've been tracking you. We've been tracking you from Venezuela to Ecuador to Peru to Mexico back to Ecuador. And we've never heard an excuse like that from you Colombian drug smugglers. What are you really doing? He said, I'm teaching the doctrine of holiness. Jesus Christ saves and sanctifies people. Why don't you show up and come to my lesson tomorrow? And they did. Those 3 Interpol agents stood at the back of the classroom, And he said, Christian Sarmiento said that night, 12 people got sanctified by the power of Jesus Christ in that classroom. What am I telling you? I'm telling you, when Jesus gives the word and the command, things look different. That was a good spot for an amen. I'll keep working on it. You know, listen to the story. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach. It's not an ordinary beach. He invites them, are you listening? He invites them, after giving them advice, to come on shore and have breakfast with him. They pull their boat up onto the beach, and they notice a charcoal fire there. And they notice that Jesus has already been cooking some fish and some bread. And he says, why don't you take some of the fish you just caught, enough to feed the neighborhood, enough to feed the village, enough to pay the mortgage. Why don't you take some of the fish you just caught and cook them with me here, and we'll have them for breakfast. He doesn't need what you have. He owns it all. He doesn't need what you have. But he gives you the dignity of using what you've been participating in and putting it to use in his kingdom for his purposes. He gives the word. Why don't you share some of the food that you've caught, and we'll eat it together? So there they are, about to eat. In other words, you didn't hear this perhaps. After conquering death and hell, the risen Jesus has nothing better to do than to go around making breakfast for his friends. Isn't that weird? In other words, he's wanting to teach them some new resurrection routines. You have to connect the big truth of what he's done because he's alive in the world with the ordinary truth of what you need to do the next day you go back to work. If you can't make that connection, if you can't take the good news that he's alive and turn it into something that you can use when you go back to work or go back to your family or go back to your neighborhood the next day, it doesn't make any difference. In other words, until his news that he's alive has become for you an assignment and a commissioning, you've not yet heard the good news. That's wonderful. I was reading from a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine. He's a pastor in North Carolina now. William Williman, he said, well, I know about this lady in my church, and frankly, she's been drawing a connection between the big news and the little details of her life. He said she had a son who was really abusive to her. He was angry and loud and physically had to be restrained once. But finally he slammed the door and walked out of her life, and yet he was arrested shortly thereafter for burglary and because of his drug habit, and was going to spend the next year in prison. And his mom kept going to see him. First weeks, he didn't even give permission for her to visit with him. He didn't want to see her, but she just kept showing up. Finally, he gave permission to meet with her down in the visiting room, and they were sitting there talking, but his language was so abusive towards his mother that the guards finally separated them and took him out of the room. She showed up the next week. She kept showing up. She was the only person who came to visit him. And now, he says, he tells this story. That young man stands and talks to his mom quietly, discreetly, respectfully. And he asked her, as her pastor, he asked her, why do you keep doing that? Why do you keep going to see your son in prison, even though he doesn't really want to see you? She said, well, I'm determined that he won't have the last word on this story. I'm not going to let him define what's going on. I have a claim on his life, and I intend to collect. You see what's going on? You connect the big news that Jesus is still alive, so anything's possible, with the little details that you're living, which mean that anything's possible. Anything's possible. Jesus ends up telling these people some things they need to hear. That's really weird. He tells them 3 different ways. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter has to put up with this. Now, I should tell you, it's because they're at a charcoal fire. Have you ever smelled one of those? They don't smell like anything else. Charcoal fire. Go back to chapter 18, verse 18 in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is being interrogated by the high priest. And out in the courtyard of the high priest's home, there's Peter standing next to a charcoal fire that the slaves and the police have made just to keep warm. And while he's there at the charcoal fire, Peter keeps denying his Lord. I don't know the man. I've never known it. I'm not one of those. I'm not one of his disciples. While in the house, Jesus keeps testifying truthfully and accurately about who he is and what he came to do. Why am I telling you that? If you'd ever failed Jesus like Peter did that night next to a charcoal fire, do you think you'd ever forget that? You think you'd ever forget the smell of that? Every time you were next to a charcoal fire, you're right back there again, aren't you? But listen to him. Jesus has to tell Peter more than once, more than twice, 3 times. Why is that? It was 3 times that Peter denied his Lord. Now Jesus tells him, tend my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. He keeps saying again and again, do the same thing that I do. In other words, he invites Peter into his life and his work. Why does he do that? It's because he's not yet done with us. I think sometimes you have to remember, this is not a romantic assignment. Feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. That's not easy work. Some of these lambs, they never grow up, do they? Some of these people that you deal with are just never going to grow up. Oh, who can tell why they get into such trouble? Why do they do it? They just seem to get out of their own way. No, they can't. They can't stop doing what they're doing. I think that's important to know. I was talking with Jeannie, a friend of mine. She's a member of the congregation I served as a pastor for 10 years. Jeannie wrote this down, gave it to me, and gave me permission to share it. So I'm going to read it to you. She said, when I was 23 years old, I was introduced to marijuana, but there were lots of reasons that it was okay back then. By 25, I was divorced and the single parent of a 10-month-old son. Life was hard, a lot of tears that no one else saw. I was drowning, I was broken, I was afraid. So every day, as soon as I got home from work, I smoked a bowl of marijuana. On weekends, I was just flat out stoned, but it was okay because it numbed the pain and the fear I lived with. The loneliness seemed unbearable, but sometimes I just reminded myself I always had my old friend marijuana to numb the pain. But I see now that all along God was still trying to talk to me, loving me. Everything I read, everywhere I went, he was gently calling me, whispering to me that I still belong to him. He spoke to me at church. He spoke to me at home, even in a magazine that I was reading while standing in line at Papa Murphy's waiting for my pizza. She said, he told me the strength I needed was not mine, but his, that I needed only to call upon him one day. So one day, I decided to put him to the test. But I didn't smoke marijuana that day, nor the next day, nor the day after that. On Sunday, Pastor Jeff gave the invitation to come forward in the church, and my eyes welled up with tears. But this time, everybody could see him. I wasn't trying to hide them anymore. And I came down and confessed to 5 sisters in Christ my dirty secret, that for 36 years, I had been addicted to marijuana on a daily basis. And they anointed my head with oil, and my sisters prayed over me. I remember I was there when it happened. They prayed over her. And when they got done with the prayer, she stood up, and through her tears, she said, I'm standing at the feet of Jesus today, and I am now a new creature. I said, I'm now a new creature. She found her altar, and it made her life completely different. Old things were gone. Behold, all things were become new. That was 8 years ago, and Jeannie's still sober. Sometimes if he gives you his invitation, you just know his is the word that has authority, and things are changed. I think it's important to know. I was reading this story, and I thought, Jesus says 3 times, just feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. In other words, if you want to get over the bad memory you have of failing and not succeeding, he's got to change your way of thinking. You've got to think about somebody other than you. Can I get a witness? You have to pay attention to somebody else besides you to get better. Sometimes that's important to know. A lady named B. Salazar learned that lesson 20 years ago. Maybe you know that name. B. Salazar had been written up in magazines. She's been on TV. Oprah Winfrey gave her $50,000 to support her work and gave her a new van. But that's not how it all started. It started when B. Salazar was a single mom of 5. She said, my grandfather had left my grandmother, my father had left my mother, and now my husband had left me. It was a bad cycle, but we needed to break it, but nobody was. She said, I was working in an assembly line, a semiconductor assembly line, and I fell one night off of a stool, and I crushed my pelvis, broke 2 discs in my back. I was in terrible pain. They put me on painkillers, but I could hardly stand it. She said, I was all by myself taking care of these 5 kids. One of my kids had to start working. He was a high school student. He had to work in the night shift just to bring home money to help support us. I didn't want that. I thought maybe if I was out of the way, at least they'd get some death benefits and they'd have enough so that my children didn't have to work like that to survive. So she said it was my plan. I was just going to take the pain pills that I'd saved up, and I was going to crush them up and have them one afternoon and take my own life. She said, before I did that, I decided I'd take the garbage out so the kids didn't have to pick up after me. I took the garbage out to the dumpster of our apartment parking lot, and I was about to throw it in, and I saw a little boy, about 5 years of age. He had his hand on a moldy piece of bread, and he was about to eat it, which is how I realized he was really desperately hungry. I slapped that moldy piece of bread out of his hand and said, you can't eat that. And he started to cry. And so she said, I knew he didn't have anything back at home. And so I picked him up in my arms, took him to my apartment, and I made him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's all I had. Gave it to him. He didn't say a word to me. Got done with that and bid him farewell. He walked out the door. 5 minutes later, he was back knocking at my door, and he had 5 other kids. And one of them said, we hear you're giving food away. She welcomed him into her house. By the end of the week, she had 13 kids from the apartment complex eating there in her apartment. Her daughter, her grown daughter, said, Mom, you can't do that. If you feed them, they'll never leave. She said, I don't know. I don't care about all that. I feel better because they need me and I can help them. She started using the only videotape she had, Little Mermaid. She would show it again and again and again. These kids didn't understand English. They didn't understand the school that they were going to. They didn't understand their textbooks. She started reading the textbooks to their kids. By the end of the summer, she had 40 kids. She asked the apartment management if there was an empty room that she could use for an after-school session. She would teach the kids. She went to a local church and talked to a minister there, and they volunteered and gave her tables and chairs and a blackboard. She now has about 200 kids. She started a not-for-profit called Bees Kids. It meets in 4 different complexes. After school, they teach lessons, they listen to the kids, they read stories, and she makes sandwiches. That's a long time ago. But it all started, she said, because I decided to feed a little kid who was crying. I don't know. The late Eugene Peterson said it this way: the uniqueness of the gospel is not that it gets us to do something entirely new, but that it sends us back to what we've been doing all along, but this time with Jesus. God wants to be in command of our lives, our work lives, our family lives, our leisure lives. All of us experience failure. We fail at many things and in many different ways. These failures are painful. Sometimes they leave us full of guilt, sometimes full of shame, sometimes overwhelmed with inadequacy. And not infrequently, they leave us determined to quit. We prove sufficiently to ourselves and to everybody else that we're not good at love, we're not good at parenting, we're not good at the whole Christian thing. We draw back, we live marginally, cautiously, safely. And then we hear Jesus say, go once again. Put your nets out into the deep water for a catch. And we say in plain truth, we've already done that. We've tried and it hasn't worked. But Jesus said, but you didn't do it with me in charge. You didn't do it with me in command. Same boat, same commands, same nets. But now Jesus is on it. And that makes all the difference.